Well, hello, everyone. My name is Tony Chen. I'm with Kinungu Ventures, and I'm here to present some research we've done on early stage ventures in Africa. So a quick background on me. I'm based in Chicago. I'm a 5-time entrepreneur. I've started a bunch of different things over the years, a whole range of different kind of experiences, crash and burn, a slow death, some exits along the way. And then God led us to spend a season in Kenya, mainly for my wife, actually, as a physician to help out there. And then while we were in Kenya, I really found my work of walking alongside entrepreneurs in East Africa. And so even though I'm a 5-time entrepreneur, I'm what you would call a first-time fund manager. So this question has really burned inside of how do you get the right capital to the right companies in the right format in Africa. And so before I got into too much investing, I wanted to learn from those that have gone before me. And so Tommy has asked me to share some research we've done over the last year and a half called Chasing Outliers. And I'm going to share my screen here and take us through a few slides. Okay, let's see. All right, so Chasing Outliers, why context matters for early stage investing in Africa. So basically, as a tech entrepreneur, I'm very, very accustomed to pivoting, iterating, kind of learning on the go, like throw up a product, get some coders on it, and then put it out in the market and get feedback in 5 weeks, and then pivot and learn and grow accordingly. Well, a very wise mentor of mine basically said, on this new journey of investing, a pivot might not take 5 weeks. It actually might take 5 years. So I might deploy all this money now, and then 5 years from now, learn that maybe I should have done it a little bit differently. So in an effort to squeeze 5 years of learning into about a year, we partook on this research journey and basically asking the question of what's working and what's not on the continent. So again, my motivation around this was to learn as much as I could, to sit at the feet that have gone before me, those that have done venture capital for the last 10, 20 years. What have they learned? What's working? What's not? And then also to then, once we're done with the research, to publish it as widely as possible, hoping that more and more people will learn about what's working and have that context to make better investment decisions on the continent. The methodology that we followed, we basically asked these 2 key questions. What drives outcomes in early stage ventures? What are some of the assumptions that are baked into the current models? We did over 100 interviews, mostly entrepreneurs and investors and what we would call limited partners, people that are funding those that making the investment decisions. We took 900 pages of notes. We recorded, transcribed our interviews, and then took those interviews, coded them into 15 different themes, and really allowing the research to show us the answers. And then again, we shared it as broadly as we could in the ecosystem. The team working on this, myself, and then 2 of probably the smartest people I know in general. So Tayo, she was the lead researcher and writer, been writing and doing research on the continent for 10 years plus. Osarumen Osamui, also really, really sharp, probably one of the deepest thinkers that I know in general, writes on a blog and does venture and other things in Nigeria. So the report we actually just published January of this year, 2021. It's an 80-page, 30,000 word report on why context really matters. It ended up getting some publicity. So that's been actually a lot of fun, just talking to different people about our findings. So with that, let me actually jump into the findings a bit. So one of the things that we've noticed is that venture capital, and in particular Silicon Valley venture capital, has been really cut and pasted onto the continent of Africa and also really, really across the world. And one of the things we've come to realize is that venture capital is actually a very, very specific tool designed for a very specific circumstance that's actually pretty unusual. So, for example, some of the underlying assumptions of venture capital is that it's these companies can grow at very little cost. So there's good infrastructure, there's low variable, cost to acquire new customers. So pouring money into these things, you can grow really, really fast. There's huge growth potential. So the market is huge, to capture. We like to talk about the lifetime value of a customer. So when a customer comes into your business, they're purchasing from you over and over again over a lifetime. So what is that customer worth to you? And venture capital assumes very, very high values and in essence, high willingness to pay and high dollar amounts of these customers. Venture capital is also designed as a way of looking for unicorns or hunting unicorns. So if I'm a venture capital firm and I have a pot of $10 million and I'm going to write, let's say 10 or 20, smaller checks in the hopes that one of those bets out of 10 will 100x. So, the other 9, it actually doesn't matter if they all go to 0, as long as the 100x's, that creates the return for the entire portfolio. And that's what people often call the power law. And then finally, venture capital assumes that there's sort of investors at every stage of a company's life cycle to pour more money into the company. So when people talk about the Series A, Series B, Series C, there's a lot of investors, let's say in the States, that specialize in whatever particular series. We're a Series B investor or we're a Series A investor. So all of these things are assumptions that underlie venture capital. So when these things are true, venture capital is, again, a great specific tool for this specific circumstance. The problem is, let's say in Africa, and really most of the world, and I would even say most of the United States, these things are not true. So let's say in Africa, there's poor infrastructure. You have people you have customers that are hard to reach, that aren't necessarily have a lot of income to share. There's undeveloped legal protection. There's complicated regulation. So it's actually hard and complicated to grow. Secondly, markets in Africa are very fragmented. They are large, but they are fragmented and they're much smaller than like the US market, of course. Customers are very much more price sensitive. They're utility sensitive, which means that if there's any kind of friction or if there's any kind of inconvenience of transacting with you, they're very quick to leave to the competitor. You also have the power law so chasing unicorns. One of the reasons why unicorns works is because there's this huge hypergrowth. So one of the underlying unhealthy dynamics that causes is that you're pushing for growth, sometimes too fast, ignoring some of the more fundamentals of the business per se. So, profitability isn't as important. As long as you're growing, that becomes a scary path. And so that pressure to grow too fast oftentimes can be toxic for companies that would otherwise be good, healthy companies that are now being forced to grow too fast, making decisions to grow too fast, and ignoring some of the underlying economics and being resilient. And for example, when a certain shock comes to the system, like a COVID or an election or a drought or a new regulation that comes from nowhere, there's no margin, right? There's no place to escape, or there's no area to kind of have a cushion for a rainy day. And then finally, there's not a lot of funding on the continent. There's sparse funding options at every stage. So even if you do have a great idea that has scalable potential, there's not a lot of funders that are willing to invest at all these stages. So all of this is just to say that these 4 underlying assumptions of venture capital are not true. So in Africa, we got to think about something differently. And so I like to use the analogy that venture capital is like a race car. It is a really, really powerful and fitting vehicle if you have smooth roads, if you have good weather, if you have little traffic, and you have a pit crew to change out your tires and put your gas into your tank every lap. So, but what if the environment is what if there's not even roads? What if there's a lot of potholes? What if there's donkeys, running around on every corner? We need to be talking about other types of investment vehicles other than race cars. Investment vehicles that are built for the context, that are built for the environment, where let's say that it's more like the off-roaders. It's more about versatile vehicles or mobility. So smaller vehicles that have a very specific purpose that can weave in and out of traffic. And unfortunately, I think too much of the conversation thus far has been more around high performance tires for race cars. We're talking about the minutia of venture capital, when in reality, we just need to be talking about different kinds of vehicles that are, what I like to say, context first. So some of the things, despite this very tricky environment, and despite the fact that venture capital is very hard to execute on the continent, we did find in our research that a lot of people are doing really interesting things. They're innovating, they're adapting in spite of, or even because of, these kinds of limitations. So first of all, there's many funds and entrepreneurs that are focusing on very, very niche strategies. There's plenty of good opportunities that still represent huge revenue potential businesses. I mean, even unicorns. So for example, some people are sometimes surprised to hear that 1/2 of the mobile money accounts in the world are in Africa. And that's kind of a perfect example of a leapfrog technology where, you can go to the local street vendor and buy a tomato with your phone, right? And that's actually more likely on the streets of Nairobi than it is in the streets of New York, right? So there's some really interesting mobile payment infrastructure and technology that people are now building on top of that create some really, really interesting opportunities. One of the things that we talk a lot about in Africa is, like, let's say you're an entrepreneur trying to solve a problem A. And as you're trying to solve problem A, you start to realize, oh, shoot, in order to solve problem A, I also need to solve problems B, C, and D. So in a way, it's almost like you're starting 4 companies to solve that first problem. So it just becomes that much more complicated, that much more expensive to solve those problems. A great example is the Indonesian company Indomie, which is like instant noodles. They wanted to bring instant noodles to Nigeria. And once they wanted to do that, they realized, there's no suppliers of good wheat. We need to start farms. Now that we got farms, we have our processing plant, the power keeps going out. We need to create a power company. And there's not a great distribution cycle for the last mile. So we actually need to create a grocery store chain. So little did you know, selling ramen noodles in Nigeria, the CEO of that company says, I know more about power plants than I do about noodles at this point, because they've had to solve all these different problems within the ecosystem, really infrastructural problems, just to get the noodles to the consumers. But along the way, they've also created some amazing value, and they've created a great moat, and they also have created essentially a series of businesses for others to build upon. So for example, I know of an investor who, one of their key investment thesis is that they invest in businesses that reduce the cost of doing business for others. So they're trying to solve, let's say, problem B, so that everyone else trying to solve problem A can rely on them to go work on their problems. So if this is a California gold rush, then someone sells some shovels and everyone else can go digging, right? Some other things that we found is that people are using different kinds of structures. They're using different kinds of financial instruments. There are kind of a plethora of different kinds of investment vehicles that you can use. There's these rolling funds that just came out a year ago. There's permanent capital vehicles. There's other kinds of structures that it doesn't have to be the typical 10-year fund that venture capitalists love. And in addition, the instruments that we use, it doesn't have to be, again, the typical, let's take this amount of equity for this stake. There's a lot of other ways to go at it. There's a lot of other instruments to look at. We talked about unicorns, right? So the unicorns that are this rarefied, mythical creature of the $1 billion company. And they're so rare, they're unicorns, right? So what we're finding also is that there are a lot of people saying, I don't need to chase unicorns. There's plenty of zebras and camels around, right? So these are companies that a typical venture capital firm would not pay attention to because they won't, 100x, but they're sort of everyday, what I would call silently successful small businesses that actually still have quite a bit of growth potential, maybe 20% a year for the next 10 years. I mean, that's some really amazing return, thinking about it that way. So there are definitely more and more firms that are looking at, we don't care about the crazy unicorns. Let's look for these silently successful zebras and camels who are also, they're engineered to last, during droughts and during tougher times. So to being more patient with that kind of crazy growth. And then time horizons. So one of the big takeaways from the research is that most investors currently underestimate what can be done in 5 years and underestimate what can be done in 15. So they're probably too bullish in the short term, but they're too bearish in the long term. A lot of value. In fact, there's some research that comes out of the Shell Foundation that talks about for emerging economies, a lot of value is created in the second decade. So, which is ironic because, the venture capital firms have already left at year 10. So I love this quote from Jim Collins: "The greatest CEOs that we've ever studied manage for the quarter century." So thinking much longer term, and not being so concerned about, the next quarter's results, so to speak. One other thing we noticed was where it's kind of an encouragement to just say, for investors and entrepreneurs, it's kind of like dating, right? It's like, do I like you? Do you like me? Are we going to form a partnership here? And I think too often, both investors and entrepreneurs, they don't know who they are, so to speak, and as such, they don't know who they're looking for. So, a lot of time is wasted in the dance of due diligence of investors saying, yeah, we do early stage tickets, and we like these kinds of things. And then as they get into it, as the discussions go to a deeper level, it turns out that when an investor says early stage, that can mean a whole lot of different things. So really getting clear about what you are and what you're not, and then the other thing is, like, a lot of investors, let's say some of the European family offices or other offices that have come in, set up shop on the continent and says, we really care about XYZ. And they hire a person on the ground to say, look for these kinds of companies, XYZ. And then they get to the ground and realize there is no XYZ. So then they have to pivot and either refine their strategy, like maybe their net was too wide, or maybe their net was actually too narrow, to say, let's also look for A, B, and C, and just to be transparent about those pivots, to be transparent about the learnings that they're learning. I think that would be very good for the ecosystem. And then I also think, like I said a little bit earlier about, the ticket size or what does early stage mean, to talk about important things earlier. So I'm not saying, to ask on the first date, do you want kids or not? But it would be good on the first date to understand like what's kind of what how do they tick and what's important to them, right? And then finally, what's another interesting dynamic on the continent is that there are a lot of foreign investors coming in, and there's this cross-cultural communication challenge, right? So, I mean, I was talking to my Dutch friend the other day, and we were laughing because he's just like, you Americans, you're so funny. You guys talk the personal stuff first, and then you get down to business where, that for us, it's like we want to talk about we want to go directly into the business, and then of course we'll talk about the personal. So it's like, how do you build trust in different cultures, and even understanding those nuances as you get into these contexts in Africa. I would say that Africa is the most diverse continent in the world in terms of language. 1/3 of the world's languages are on the continent. And even within the same country, there's diversity. So that if you look at the 10 most diverse countries in the world, they all also reside in Africa. So there's just a lot of nuance to think through, and to manage those nuances, to understand the context, and then to be able to manage whatever conflict does come back better is a key aspect of some of the learnings that we found. And then finally, I'll just mention there is kind of an investor power dynamic where it's kind of the investors coming in with the power and the leverage and being able to dictate the terms and dictate kind of who they want to meet. And that has also created a little bit of a conflict and a dynamic that we can all work on more. So looking ahead, I think too many investors are blindly following others, or blindly applying venture capital models in, and not thinking more clearly, more nuanced, more about the context. I think some things that we can innovate around the continent is, how do you structure incentives? How do you actually structure the fund to create more flexibility, let's say for longer term time horizons? How do we do due diligence, right? So if you're writing a $50,000 check to a company, but it costs you $5,000 in 6 months to figure out if you want to make the investment, that's obviously not going to be a very great business plan for a fund. And then also, like, how do you build trust, and how do you think about time horizon in a different way? So that's pretty much the summary of the research. You can find more information about, you can actually download and read the entire research here on this website, kenyungu.com, Chasing Outliers. And you can read all about it there. We have kind of the executive summary that's about 10 pages. And then the full report is about 80 pages that really digs deeper into a lot of these issues. So that's really my summary so far.